Hey there, I'm Neil, my pronouns are he, him, and I'm the host of my new podcast, Pause and Rewind. I'll be chatting to changemakers, thought leaders and role models who all share a common goal. They're striving to make the world a more inclusive place. And, let's face it, we need it. Each guest has a unique story when it comes to doing their thing, and we often know who people are in the now, but how much do we really know about them? Pause and Rewind takes a moment to explore the experiences in my guest's life that led them to where and who they are now. Because everyone loves an origin story. We'll dive into tales, anecdotes, and what makes our guests tick. So, are you ready to pause and rewind? Hey everyone, and welcome to this episode of Pause and Rewind. I chat to Katya Veleva, a diversity, equity and inclusion consultant that I met very recently through my role at We Create Space. And they have had a massive impact on me. I really love what they do, and I love the abundance of colour, insight and energy that they bring to stuff, as well as creativity. Katya is incredibly creative and innovative and just has a way of engaging with people of all levels, and we touch a little bit on that. So yeah, just the way that they bring that work to DEI is just incredible. This conversation has some really touching moments where Katya talks about their mum, and it's a really beautiful conversation. There are some challenging moments too. Please do take care of yourself whilst listening, but enjoy. Let me know what you think. Here it is. Hey there, Katya. Welcome to Pause and Rewind.
Hi, Neil. It's great to be here.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you. I feel that getting to know you over the last few months has been such a joyful explosion of insight and shared love of colour.
Absolutely. I do have a huge love of color, and you can't miss it when you look at me every time.
No, we wouldn't want to. Let's kick off with a big question. What does the world look like for Katya Veleva right now?
Woof. I mean, it's been tough, I'm not gonna lie, and we've chatted about this before. I think in the last year, things have particularly gotten difficult. Um, for queer people generally, for diversity and inclusion professionals as a whole as well. But it's been ramping up for several years, and I think you'll know that the canaries have been singing in the mine for a while, and we're seeing the results and we're seeing the build up. So it's tough, but I try very hard to balance it with a little bit of color. That's my that's my balm. Usually when things get real tough, I pull out the paints and I make it a little bit better like that. But yeah, there's a lot to paint over right now.
It's so interesting the way that we're all coping with that and rallying around each other to uplift each other. And I think the way that you do that is so beautiful. And so tell us a little bit more about your professional background, where your passion lies. Obviously, I know this, but just for the audience.
Of course. Well, when you look at my CV black and white, it can feel like a little bit of a jump up and down, but ultimately, and very aligned to some of our mutual connections, I've always wanted to create space for people. I started off in architecture when I was young. I was obsessed with becoming an architect, and I worked within architecture and healthcare design for quite a few years, which is an enriching and successful career. But it really wasn't what I expected it to be, and I kind of naturally started evolving into digital adoption and then in diversity and inclusion. It sounds kind of not connected, but it really, really is, because in construction, digital adoption has a lot to do with getting different disciplines to collaborate together, which again might sound like have they not been doing that before, but they didn't necessarily in real time. And there's some new digital tools that kind of facilitate that, and I was working a lot on them. And in parallel with that, of course, a lot of inclusion work within construction, which is a challenging place for inclusion, to say the least. And I kind of naturally turned into this. And I always like to say that I used to be focused on kind of the context, the buildings, and now I'm kind of moving into the content, the people. Because ultimately, it doesn't matter how amazingly a space is designed, if the culture that lives within it is pretty exclusive and difficult, it's not going to be great for people to be there. So this is how I find myself here today, as an inclusion, equity, and diversity consultant, and kind of specializing mainly in gender and sex characteristics, but working across inclusion for all.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I think you bring it right back to people there. You know, there's loads of work out there around sustainability and the way that spaces are built. You know, I think about Caroline Credo Perez's book, Invisible Women, right? And the way that buildings and cities are typically catered for men, and how we need to think about how spaces, physical spaces, the metaphorical spaces that exist, encompass the needs of all people.
Absolutely. I can talk forever about this. And that was very also intentional. At one point in history, there was a decision made that women should live in the home and men belong in the public sphere. And then the world was simply designed to follow this rule. And again, the people who design our built environment right now are predominantly rich men from the dominant ethnic majority of whatever the environment is. And that's simply not right, because ultimately that's a minority and we all live in the built environment. Just one number here to always think it's quite well descriptive. So housing is probably one of the most urgent kind of needs in the built environment. I think everybody will agree. We know also that we need social housing specifically, and so on. A lot of the people who design that housing will have gone to private schools and will have lived a very different life. How will they know what that means to be there? Do you want to guess what percentage of qualified architects in Britain are Black women?
I have no idea, but I have a feeling that I won't be. I'll be horrified, but not surprised.
0.3.
Right.
And we definitely see a huge phenomenon of what I like to identify myself as the recovering architect. People kind of leaving in WODs from the profession because the culture is kind of difficult. And after 2020, I knew quite a lot of my friends who belong to a minority, but very often the Black women in the office were kind of tasked with, apart from their full-time job, to kind of deal with the diversity and inclusion bits around. And ultimately, that's just too much to ask from people.
Yeah. So, it's a stark reality, isn't? There's so many sectors and industries that just need full overhauls when it comes to who's running them, and levels of collaboration, which I know you're passionate about, and co-production. How are you looking after yourself against this backdrop of anti-LGBTQ rhetoric and kind of like, the struggles within those of us working in DEI? How do you look after yourself?
I try to find some balance. I'm very kind of adamant in, stopping work at an afternoon good time, like 6, 7 max, and that's it. There's no late working, there's no weekend working, to kind of compartmentalize those things in particular hours so that I know that I have some availability to myself. And then I try to find things that allow me to escape. I love swimming and cycling. That's definitely big for me. But painting is the most important thing for my soul. It's what I completely kind of lose myself in, to give myself some kind of outlet and peace. And a thing that I create that I know it's good.
Yes, there's something about that, isn't that? One of the reasons that I launched the podcast is a bit, is obviously, I work for We Create Space. I've co-founded my other things, and I wanted something that was me.
Yeah.
And that's so important that we have that personal investment and passion.
I'm extremely convinced that creativity is fundamental to healing of all sorts. There is something very cathartic in creation because you take all the power of whatever you're making. I made all of the decisions for this, and I decided to put it up on the wall to make it exist. And that kind of, I think it reminds you that you can do that with yourself.
Yeah.
And you know that it's hard and you know it takes practice. Also, the practice of creating reminds you how these things work with yourself. And you're like, okay, it's all right if this didn't work, if that, workout plan or whatever it was a learning point, because then I have the next one and the next one. And I know exactly how many paintings I've made and what percentage of them are really, really good and what aren't. And that kind of gives you this perspective and, I don't know, anchoring in your own creation of yourself.
I love that. I love that. A friend of mine, Jasmine Predecito, she is an artist and an engineer, and she's absolutely wonderful. I don't know if you've come across Jasmine's work, but it's embedded in sustainability and nature and beauty. And I think that Jasmine, when she talks about creativity, she takes it back to play, and I know that play is something that you're quite passionate about as well. But how our views of creativity are actually often quite narrow. And we just see it in the binary, right? We think it's one thing, but actually creativity is choosing the socks you wear in the morning, throwing an outfit together, choosing a different running route each day that's going to kind of like, entice me and like make my run more enjoyable. So it's not just creating something in the traditional sense. It's any way that you engage in a creative lens.
Yeah, absolutely. It's how they define it. It's the capacity to come up with original ideas that have value. That's
Yeah.
what creativity is. And also, I mean, beauty is so subjective. And I think when we talk about creativity, we immediately imagine painting, sculpture making, art making. And for art to be art with a capital A, we feel like it needs to be beautiful. But what is that even?
Yeah.
On that topic as well, I feel very strongly that, forget about that. If you're creating something, you're being creative. And you can find so much more in it than beauty. So yeah, I think everybody should engage in any of those things that you find a little bit intimidating as well, like painting, drawing, sculpture making, DIYs, crafting, just to kind of break out of this feeling that something needs to look a certain way, but just to experience making.
Yes. Yes, it's not the end result, it's the process. It's the finding the beauty in that as much as the end piece. Before we dive into your story, which I'm really, really excited about, what are some of the biggest myths and misconceptions around DEI that you'd personally like to smash? That's just something that came to mind.
You have a sledgehammer.
I'll send it over.
God, thank you. I'll definitely use it. So there's a lot that kind of needs to be deconstructed fundamentally. I think I'm really struggling with getting clients to do proper measuring and investigative work. I think the myth there is that we have this particular target that has a big red dot on it, and if we aim well enough and pull the trigger when we need to, get to the target and we're done. It's not a finished job. D&I is not a finished job. It's very much a continuous improvement process that can support a business. But also there's a lot of tension between deeper D&I approaches and capitalism as such. And that's a line that's very hard to toe. And I think if we completely disregard it, then the work becomes very superficial. But also if we absolutely press the pedal on it, it becomes impossible to do the work. So it's a very delicate balancing act. In so many ways. But I think the biggest, most important thing to never forget is we need to keep doing this as if it's never going to get to a finite kind of position.
Yeah, especially right now.
Yeah, especially right now.
Especially right now. Katya, thank you so much for joining me. And we could talk about this all day, but for now, are you ready to press pause and rewind?
Absolutely, let's do it.
Let's do this. Take me back. Tell me all about little Katya.
Well, I was born in Bulgaria, and I was born quite literally 2 months before communism fell in our country. So I'm a child of the revolution. You can see it like that if you like.
I love that.
Yeah. That sounds great, and it's very funny. Actually, I've done research around the change there, and obviously in the late 80s and early 90s in Eastern Europe, there was a lot of unrest. There was a lot of things happening, and it was very important that they were happening. There was a lot of foreign press, a lot of kind of you can see pictures of the protest there, and they're all color pictures, and it looks very exciting. And then if you look at like reporting and photography, like maybe 5 years after, there's no foreign press because it's not exciting anymore. The revolution's kind of stopped. And all the pictures are black and white because obviously we couldn't afford color cameras or whatever. And they look like pictures from the 60s, 50s and 60s. It's so strange when you kind of put them on a timeline. And I've had to do that for different projects. And I just kind of looked at it, was like, oh, this is a great illustration of like the excitement of something new, and then kind of how heartbreakingly difficult it is to stand up from the ruins of a system. And that's kind of very much was what the backdrop of my upbringing was. My first memories kind of have to do with that, the challenges of what that looks like.
Yeah. What are some of the standouts that still like ring true in those memories?
Well, something that's been coming up a lot in the last couple of years has been really my relationship with money, and how because now we're in a cost of living crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we had a lot of challenges at the start of the pandemic, which I found kind of when the shops were empty. They weren't really that empty, like there were things missing, but like I remember empty shops, and
Yeah.
that was not it. But these things kind of have come a full circle for me. And one of the things that really left the mark was kind of money losing value overnight. So I don't know if you're familiar, and maybe many people aren't, so I'll just explain what it is. We had hyperinflation. So when the system collapsed, that was held by a lot of debt and various other kind of connections with the rest of the Eastern Bloc. Between 89 and 95 and 96, in Bulgaria, we had 3,000% inflation.
Wow.
I don't know if you can imagine what that means, but
No,
it
it
was
seems
also
so huge.
it's wild. It's absolutely wild. I think the it's literally 3,000. In 89, one piece of our currency was $1, and then in 5 years it was 3,000. And there was also a period of time where, because there wasn't clarity of exactly what was happening with the economy, communist economies are usually built in 5-year segments. So this is kind of the reason why it started showing up about 5 years after, because things were kind of set up and sorted out for the next 5 years. And there was a period of time where the fluctuation was so rapid and so often that in grocery stores, you'd have like little TVs that people would track the value of the currency. And as you're queuing, and I have a very clear memory of that. We had these shops where it's not like supermarkets here where you walk and pick up your things. Everything is kind of behind a glass display of a fridge, and you just kind of are handed things. And we were queuing alongside this display where the cheese was, and we were third in line to like ask for the piece of cheese or whatever. And while we were waiting, they changed the price of cheese twice.
Wow.
We were third in the queue. It wasn't that slow of a kind of an environment. I also remember my dad used to work in the next town over, and at lunchtime he'll call from his office and ask me to run to the shop to check prices of things, because obviously this is only stationary phones. I'll run like I'm the kid then. They send me to run to the shop because there's no phones. This is how you pass information with running children around. And I'll come back, we'll call him, we'll tell him, cheese is that much. And then he'll negotiate his salary. And then sometimes by the time he's back at 5 o'clock to go shopping with us to get something for dinner, it's already not relevant. It's already not enough for like a kilo of cheese or whatever it was. So it was so kind of stressful and unpredictable and completely devoid of reason, right? Both of my parents have degrees in chemistry, chemical engineers, right? Like they've been told their entire life that this is kind of how you step one, two, three, four, then you have a family, and then everything's fine and safe. We weren't rich or anything like that when my sisters were growing up, but they didn't expect at all for this to happen, to completely lose everything overnight. And it was just a tough time for sure.
Those are quite heavy memories to have as a child. Like, I mean, we all remember kind of like stark historical incidents as kids, right? The shocking things and things that maybe stand out as they're not so great parts of history, but those are quite heavy things for a child to carry. Have you been able to work through those? How do you reconcile those now?
I think healing is a bit of a spiral, in a good way. You go through these things, you kind of first acknowledge them and you feel like, okay, now I figured out I can't do this because of this. And, like this has happened in my childhood, so this is what I do now. And then you go through the spiral again and you think you're all good with things, and then they come back again on a different level. So I've done a lot of therapy. I've been in therapy for over 12 years, I think. And it does help to have a space and time to discuss and understand those things. I found that at one point I kind of hit a ceiling with that. And something that I'm kind of paying more attention on now is kind of my body and more somatic healing.
Yeah.
Because, the body keeps the score. So I can't say that I've sorted those things out in full, but I kind of keep going and keep recognizing, keep trying to, make space for them. But it's tough.
Yeah. There's a lot of acceptance, I think, that has to come from it, and then rather than ever thinking that the impact of such experiences will go away, it's how do you cope with them, and how do you look after your body and your mind through them. I 100% feel that. But what were you, backdrop aside, what were you like as a kid? What are some of your memories of what you were like, and what are maybe some anecdotes that you've heard about yourself?
Well, I'm the youngest of three, and I'm by far I'm quite removed from my sisters. They're 8 and 10 years older than me.
Okay.
So I kind of felt like almost at times like a single child, because they went to study in high school. We all like had to leave home when we were 13, 14 for school. And I mean, I was a weird kid in many ways, as we all are. I never really felt like I fit in my hometown. I grew up in a small town, and I just always felt like the odd one out.
Same.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard to explain, but why? What was and there were so many kind of things that kind of built on that feeling. And it's funny because now I'm kind of longing for a small town comfort and peace. But, once you've kind of established yourself, I think it's much easier to find space in a community like that. But obviously there were traditions, there were kind of I don't know, aspects of the environment which really didn't serve me well. I was always quite strong-headed and quite convinced in what I wanted to do, very like proactive and with very strong opinions. I've softened out so much, and I'm still fairly opinionated. So you can imagine I was a very kind of loud child, but I have my mom to thank for that, and my parents as many have their flaws, but my mom was always very, very adamant on kind of addressing us as equals.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, if she wanted me to do something, or if we had an argument, she would never just assert herself and her power over me. We'd have an argument. We'd yell at each other if we needed to, but it would need to be a discussion. There would need to be um, just getting it out there. And that really built my confidence
Yep.
uh, to be able to know that no, my views matter and what I feel and want is important. Um, and I think, I mean, she may have regretted that at times, but it always felt like I had that kind of power over myself. Sometimes I think, to be honest, and kind of later in life, I've seen situations where I've believed I had that power and it didn't really. And that was a little bit of a delusion that didn't carry me in the best ways possible. But sometimes it did.
Yeah.
And I'm really, really grateful for it. No, my mom was great. Her name was Katya. Um, and yeah, she used to. So back home, it's very common to, you know, you address everybody as auntie and uncle. There's no Mr. and Mrs. We're auntie and uncle culture. Um, and that's the illustration of how she treated young people and children. She would never let people call her auntie. She was like, Petya, my name is Petya, you're talking to me. And she would ask my friends to call her Petya. And they always thought that was so cool. And she was like, cool. I'm not like other moms. I'm a cool mom. So yeah, that's very much how she was kind of setting the scene for me.
Do you think that that influence, that, you know, beautiful memory, do you think that's shown itself up in the way that you advocate for yourself and others, and perhaps are not afraid to go against the grain?
Yeah, I think it's definitely informed my communication styles with
Mm.
people. I've never been kind of intimidated speaking to anyone despite of their rank or
Yeah.
position. Um,
I mean, you work with leaders, right? You
yes.
know, organizational change, going in and telling people how it is and working with them.
Yeah.
Like, you can definitely see that in you.
Yeah, and that's 100% my mom. I do a mentor training as well that I usually start with this, like a picture of her being like, it's her fault. And I think like supporting people in their growth in any way, it's fundamental to address them over here at eye level, right? Like you're there with them because nobody feels they're talked down on for
Yeah.
sure. And if you talk down from at someone, they're never going to hear you.
No.
They're never
No.
going to take you at your full value. So that's a very much her.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you for sharing. She sounds amazing.
Mm,
Um, it sounds like you had quite a strong identity from a young age, but let's move on to your teenage years.
mm,
For many of us, particularly in the queer community, these are quite the for anyone they're quite formative years, but for as queer people they can be quite difficult. Changing our bodies, first heartbreak, relate with figuring out the world. What does that look like for Katya?
well, I didn't come out until quite late, and I'm a wide range queer. So in the environment I lived in, it was very easy to remain straight presenting, um, because it was also just so unwelcoming, right?
Mm.
I remember I've always been attracted to women. I don't even have a memory of not being attracted to women, but our culture is so misogynistic, so um, deeply prescriptive of gender roles. And there is this constant pitting of women against each other.
Mm.
And we have an idiom that I always like. I think this is the best illustration of like how my mind was formed. We'd say one woman met another snake,
One
right?
woman met another snake.
Right? It's
Oh,
ultimately equating women to snakes.
yeah.
So my thinking was like, oh yeah, of course, all women are sexy. That's fine, but I'd never have a relationship with a woman because women are snakes, right? This was very much my teenage mind, and I completely dismiss kind of this existence of those I mean, I say I completely dismissed them. I always kind of had it in the back of my mind that like I think I imagined myself probably like having like some experiences with women, but ultimately, of course, you need to have a husband and like, you know,
Mm.
children and like it's kind of we have a it's very strange because we have ultimately fairly sexually liberated culture, at least when I was growing up. The far right is coming everywhere, so things are changing. So there was never whenever I speak to my British friends specifically, so many people had such a taboo around sex and sexual relationships in
Yeah.
school. It was just nobody spoke about it. People had no idea about what was going on. We were only talking about this.
Right.
Like it was the main subject of interest in our like kind of in our space, and it wasn't like there was no separation between boys and girls. We were in kind of bigger groups and discussed things, and like you know when someone had sex for the first time, their friends would be like, "Okay, cool. So now you want to start seeing gynecologist regularly. This is how you do tests, and this is
That's
fine."
so healthy.
It was really good in that sense, but it was very heterocentric.
Right.
Um, and similarly with adults as well. Like I've never felt like I had a barrier to speak to my parents
Hmm.
about things like that, and also they knew we were teenagers who were having
Yeah.
sex. Like it wasn't this like taboo awful thing. It's just like sure, but you know, be smart about it, and here's how to be smart about it. So in a lot of sense, that felt really good and fine, especially kind of, you know, knowing what's fine and what isn't, how to get help if you need to, that sort of thing. Yeah, sorry, what was the start of that question?
Oh, it was just around your teenage years and
Yeah.
what that looked like for you. But I guess if you've got that kind of open side of it, but then very heteronormative, I guess.
Mm,
So how did you navigate your queer identity in that?
mm. Well, that's the other thing, though. Again, money comes into the picture and survival. Really, there wasn't time to think about that at all.
Mm.
So I had to move away from home when I was 14 to go to school because we didn't have good schools around my hometown. And I was living on and off with my mom and then by myself, and it was just really hard to cope. I was always very ambitious. I was always very much like I'm going to change the world. I'm going to be the most amazing one. And I wanted to go to the best school, and naturally that required quite a lot. So I had to start doing part-time jobs quite early just to make ends meet. And I was just too busy to think about anything else, right? Like I school starts at 7:30, it finishes at like 2 or 3. Then I have my Japanese speech contest prep for a few hours afterwards, and then in the evening I go and work in a juice shop until 11 o'clock, and then get back home and do homework until after midnight. That's you kind of like there's just so much to do you can't think about it. And I had a boyfriend in high school, again, very much kind of falling into all of the prescriptions and the right thing. I was the smartest girl in the class. At least I thought I was a girl. And he was the smartest boy. And it was all very correct,
Mm.
right? You know, and he was a great guy, you know, bless him. I'm very lucky to have had a very kind of lovely introduction to love um, with this person. But it was, you know, just like very following the lines and making sure that, you know, I'm creating a stable base for what's coming after. So there was just very little space to think um, and allow for that.
Is that what do you think that's part of influence why you're so protective of your space to create and just be now because of that constant solidly having to
Oh yeah,
work?
absolutely. I mean, I think I've always wanted to be an artist, but in my mind, I was never allowed to, right? Because it
Okay.
just, when you're in survival mode, art careers are not a thing, right? Like, what are you talking about being an artist? You need to make money. That's not a thing. And I think I just like, I thought about it. Okay, what's the closest thing that's a real, quote unquote, real profession that I'll still have some kind of creative expression? And that was architecture. Um, and again, I think when I was young, I don't know what programmed me like this, but I became kind of very clear that if I want to achieve anything, I need to be super sure about it and very passionate about it. And I would manufacture that for myself and like make it, if I want to be an architect, I really want to be the best architect. And I want it the most in the world, and it comes from my heart, and all that kind of, I think I've lost the line of what was manufactured and what was natural in
Mm.
a way. But I had to completely stifle this kind of desire to do art, and we didn't really have much art in school at all. Not to mention that it was just so inaccessible in terms of like just buying stuff to make art. That wasn't possible to me. And now I have adult money. Hey, baby, those Posca pens, those Posca pens.
You're living it, and I guess one thing that's coming through for me is kind of this very strict routine, and then this very like this is how I'm going to do things, very very structured, through to who you are now. That seems to have allowed things to develop organically. You kind of like been in one profession and making waves in digital and architecture and that side of things, but actually shifted, and there seems to be more of an organic freedom to how you operate now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you learn your lessons, right? And it wasn't easy at all. I definitely had to break myself to be able to change in that way. It was very, very hard. Like even during university, again, I was working a ton of part-time jobs just
Mm.
to make it
Same.
work. And that was just exhausting all the time. At the end of university, I have a 2-1, and I'm so proud of that 2-1. I can't tell you how much, right? Because it took to the nail. I was in the weekends, and at some nights I was working like a mama, 12-hour shifts on the weekends,
So
right?
where did you go to uni?
Portsmouth.
Portsmouth, nice.
Yeah. Um, and then like during the week, I'd do like work with university. I started mentoring then with like young kids and stuff. And on Sunday night, I'd come back home at like 1 o'clock after running tables all day. And I started model making for studio next day throughout the night, then spend the whole day in studio afterward. Like I did not sleep. For 3 years, I don't think I slept at all. And that exhaustion kind of gets you at some point. It gets you, and you
Yeah,
have to reevaluate. And it wasn't once. Like I broke once in university, broke once in high school. Actually, I literally I fainted once because I was working so hard. I think I was in 11th grade. Then in university, and then after I'd gone and I'd worked for about 2 3 years in architecture, specifically in planning and kind of design. I looked back into like I was supposed to go back to university to get the master's degree to finalize the qualifications. And I remembered those things, and I was like, no, I
can't
can't.
do it.
I can't do this, because if I have to go back now, I'll still have to work my butt off in a very unhealthy way just to make ends meet. And I don't have it in me anymore.
Yeah.
And I think you kind of chip away into kind of starting to see that maybe you can't control everything. Maybe there are some things you need to kind of allow to happen themselves. So there's been a lot of learning and change, and kind of how it all came together.
Let's talk about change. What was the move from Bulgaria to the UK like?
Well, so I always knew I didn't want to live in Bulgaria.
Hmm.
I never felt comfortable. There's a lot of corruption. Ultimately, that's always been the big problem for me. I like a rule. I like to know, when I go in, what I'm putting in and what's kind of expected of me. And it almost, if you want to function, and I'm saying this, I haven't lived in Bulgaria in 15 years.
Hmm.
Things may have changed. But that's my impression of when I was growing up. You couldn't just do a job or do a business and be successful. You had to have another entire separate brain to think about all of the backdoor stuff that's going on. And I always knew I couldn't cope with that. um it's this is what happens when a system is ruined, and other things start to organically, quote unquote, evolve. Not to mention, I don't think I understood how much the culture was affecting me. Um, I had and initially I really wanted to go to Japan. I studied Japanese in high school. And I prepared like wild for these Japanese scholarships that they do. The Japanese Ministry of Education runs this exam in the entire world to get the cleverest people and gives them full run in their universities. And I could have gone for a humanity subject. I would have absolutely aced that exam, but I decided to go with the sciences because architecture fell in that, and I couldn't get to it. Like it just the physics exam was very, very hard. And ultimately, that was my first goal. I just need to, like, I'll go to Japan. That's the thing. And then that didn't work out. And the next thing was like, well, I speak English very well. And we'd just gotten into the European Union, which meant we could get student loans to pay for education here. And I was like, well, that's the thing that I can do, and I'll work and I'll make it kind of happen. But first, because of applying for that first scholarship, I kind of had a year to make out because you can only sit certain exams like the TOEFL exams and so on that you need at certain times of the year. So I spent some time in Malta to like try and get some money for there. And I had a huge, like, shocking realization in Malta because in terms of like culture and how much it kind of influenced me. I was positively catcalled for the first time in Malta when I was 19. And I didn't like I was flattered. I was so excited, and it sounds awful, but because in Bulgaria it's so scary, like it's even like catcalling doesn't feel right to call it because people just verbally attack you on the street, right? And I wasn't even as fat as I am now. I was like half the size that I am. Definitely a lot of body image issues that have started there, and now look at pictures and I'm like, I was insane. I was just a healthy child. But anyway, like on the street, in the bus, people just tell me to put away my huge, awful thighs, and that they can't be witnessing something as disgusting in me. And things like that kind of happen a lot if you're not super skinny. This is the sort of catcalling, and it has its sexual undertones as well, and it's pretty shit. But it could never be confused as a compliment, right? The way we talk about this. And I remember it was literally my first day in Malta, and I was wearing these yellow shorts, and I crossed the street, and someone said something nice about my ass, and I was like, oh, whoa, what's going on? And I started to kind of piece it together because you accept this as normality. You accept this as kind of like what the world is. And you just protect yourself, right? Because the first thing is to kind of build that shell. But it was, and again, you kind of later in time, you start remembering things of like, oh, this was really, really effed up, like real bad. So when I first moved away from home to study, I would have been 14, 15. And there was this dodgy area that I needed to pass through to get from home to school. And my oldest sister, and again, no shade to her, she was a child as well, and she was trying to protect me. But what she said was like, again, I wasn't fat. I was a healthy looking child, just not skinny. And she said, oh, Katya, I'm kind of glad you're a little bit chubby because I'm not so scared someone's gonna rape you on the way home.
Oh, that's, yeah.
And this was the most normal thing to say, right?
Right.
So kind of, I think naturally I always wanted to get out of that environment. Yeah. But while you're in it, it's not very helpful to point at those things and notice them because you'll lose your mind. So you're just kind of focusing on a target, and you're moving through and you're trying to get out of there. So I worked in Malta for a bit, and then I came to England, and it felt good because they did quite a lot of these like university festivals and so on back home. They really British universities love Eastern European students.
They do. I worked at one for 10.5 years, and we always used to go to countries and exhibit at fairs and try and attract students. So yeah, and particularly in the Eastern European countries.
We're very academic. So like our secondary education is extremely academic. So we on paper show very, very well. I have my criticisms of our education, and I think there just needs to be more creativity and so on. But they want us because it looks very, very good. I came out of high school with the equivalent of 14 A levels, and I had A stars in all of them.
Wow.
And I mean, I was very smart, but it's not.
Very smart.
Well, yeah. I think about this. I don't know why I thought about this a week or so ago. It's like, wow, like I was real clever kid. I think I was watching a movie of a kid in America kind of getting scholarships and stuff. It was like, I would have completely flown through. I would have, if I was born in the US or in the UK or somewhere like Western, I would have had 3 PhDs by now, easily. But anyway, what a show that they say. So yeah, in one of those festivals, I got hooked, and it felt very inviting because it's great to feel that you're wanted and kind of come in, and ultimately, comparatively, it's way easier to get in a British university than a Bulgarian one. Which sounds strange, but it's kind of the opposite when you're passing them.
Yeah.
It's very easy to get in the university here, but you're going to pass if you really put the work in. Back home, you really need to work extremely hard to get in, but once you're in, it's a fly through kind of thing. Right. And it's also because education here is designed to educate the world, while back home, it's very kind of tied into like, oh, we're like a 7 million people country. Like, how many architects do we need per year, really? Yeah. So it's very exclusive especially in certain professions. And
you've used the term back home, and obviously Bulgaria is where you were born and such. Where do you identify as home? Is London and the UK home for you? Is it not quite as straightforward as that for you?
Such a good question and such a good thing to notice. I do use that expression because it feels the easiest, but neither really. I think this is the toughest part of being an immigrant, is that, I mean, you chose to leave somewhere because it wasn't right for you, right? Like it just, and I don't feel at home in Bulgaria, even like, especially now with a beard, I can't be like that at home. Like,
is there a freedom? Do you know? And obviously, it's not easy being part of the LGBTQ community in the UK either. But did you feel a sense of, from what you've shared, did you feel a sense of freedom in Malta and then the UK that you hadn't felt before in who you were?
Certainly, absolutely, for sure. There are like aspects of myself that I didn't at all. I wasn't ready to discover until I lived here for a number of years as well. I was engaged at one point, and I think this is the time where I most felt at home. And I think it just has to do with family and kind of immediate surroundings. And when that didn't come to fruition as well, that was a bit of an uprooting for me as well. And I'm a little bit of in a floating state right now, because sometimes I managed to get a passport. They can't kick me out. Wow.
Well, hey.
Scary. So it definitely is more home than Bulgaria, but there are still times where I know I'm not of here. It's very kind of clear and palpable that I'm not of here.
Yeah, and there are moments since 2016 probably that it hasn't felt the most inviting and welcoming for immigrants. So
absolutely. And it's strange because sometimes I spoke to a friend of mine who's Brazilian and also queer a few years back, and we found ourselves in this cycle, and both of us did the same thing. Like we'd go back home, we'd spend some time there, it'd be freaking awful for many reasons, and then you just come back and you're like, oh my God, I'm so happy to be back. It's so great. And you're like, never going back. It's so bad for my mental health, especially when you're on like actually counted numbers of annual leave and stuff. Like, I can't believe I wasted my holiday for this. I need another week of holiday to recover. Yeah. And then, a year passes, maybe a little bit over a year, and I'm chatting to my dad on Zoom, and I see the back of the wall, and I see like, oh, this is so much, and you just kind of remember just the good things, and you go back again, and you're like, oh,
the cycle. The cycle, and I've heard many other queer people say a similar thing about where they're from, including, I live in London including the way I feel about going back to Essex. You know, it's just down the road, but you know, same cycle sometimes. Those same like, why am I here? Like, I don't belong here. You
Mm.
know. So no, I get it. Let's bring it up a little bit to now. What was the moment where you found your voice and destination in inclusion?
Oh, well, it would have been while I was still working in architecture. And at the time, I was dating someone who at the time identified as a woman, very, very gender fluid and quite androgynous looking. Mm, and she was having a lot of issues with public bathrooms. And that's 2015, 16, right? Before it became a thing.
Mm.
She would still like get yelled at and you know, assigned female at birth, right? Like, and I was planning toilets. I was literally planning toilets at the time. And I was like, wait, what are we doing? And the first thing I did was actually I was working in HKS, and I did like a little bit of a lunch and learn to educate my colleagues around like what it actually means. Like when we're talking about gender neutral bathrooms, and the company was actually American, so there was a little bit of influence. It had started to whiff from the US a little bit around that. It wasn't nearly where it is now, but you know, it was the start of it. And I just did all the research around it, and I did it in the context of planning, because also in terms of planning, it's just so much more effective to have single use cubicle with enclosed wash hand
Mm.
basins. And there's no reason for those to be gendered. That's a fully
No.
enclosed room,
Yep.
single occupancy. Your bathroom at home is what this is, right? Not to mention that now that we've had the pandemic, we know that that's hygienically it's so much more effective and really limits the spread of viruses if you have that kind of layout. And I kind of did all of the numbers, and we know all this. I'm not going to repeat it, like around like where really violence exists and who the
Yep.
victims are. How, you know, I really laid it out for them. And the company itself was moving to a new office like within the next couple of months, and they made all of the new facilities gender neutral, and it felt like the biggest win.
That
Like,
is a fucking huge win. Like from a lunch and learn, from a lunch and learn. What a really tangible moment to pinpoint the influence of where you are now back to that. That is incredible.
yeah, it felt really good. And it's also one of those flag moments. Me and my trans friends, we have this joke about like the very passionate trans ally and like give them a minute. And that was kind of I think the case for me because at the time I was very femme presenting and
Yeah.
identifying and like, you know, I wasn't, and if you want, we can talk about the kind of coming out story of it all as well. But I wasn't doing this for me. I'm not doing this for me. This
Yeah.
is like kind of like it's for care and for practicality and so on. Just like it was for me, already was
Yeah.
in the long term. Um, but I just wasn't ready to, you know, see it from my own angle at the time. So yeah, that was definitely a turning point. And the thing that really solidified it, so 3 years after that lunch and learn, 3 years, I wasn't working in that company anymore. And I found myself on a pride float. How? It's a long story, but I was on a pride float. And it was really amazing. I was screaming. It was brilliant. And someone tapped me on the shoulder, and I turned around and I recognized the face. I can't really. I know his name now is Giuseppe, but I couldn't even remember his name because that was a big company, and I don't think we were working in the same building either. And he was like, "Oh, hi, it's so good to see you. You know, I remember what you were doing, like in the office, and like how out you were, and all these things, and it really made me feel better being myself." And he had a PhD in I think urban planning. He was so much more senior than me even at the time, and to just get that and three
Yeah.
years after to remember it and to have made a difference. He's Italian as well, so I think that also may have had a finger in it. But like knowing that just doing that has had this lasting impact.
Yeah.
It's like this is it. Let's gather together and go for doing that because it feels so much more satisfying.
I love that. I love that. So, before we move, what happened next? Like, what were your next steps
In terms of
in
moving.
terms of moving the career? Yeah.
Well, at the time I just did that because I felt like it was an important thing to do. I had started to like educate myself more around certain topics. Again, I had so much to unlearn. As a
Mm,
teenager, I was one of those people who said like, I'm not a feminist because this is equal for everyone, right? Like
yeah.
this is kind of the culture and stuff that I'm coming from. I have a lot to say also around like what communism and absolute equality has done for true inclusion. I think we have a lot of problems from that, and I think
Mm,
it becomes harder to get people on board who come from this kind of culture because there was just so strong of a. I mean, I'm going to say it felt like a brainwashing that you're equal, you have not
yeah.
to talk about. But when you start examining it, so much of that absolute equality was only addressing things that are important to men, like career and school.
Right.
So we have quotas and all that. Bulgaria is the only country that has more female programmers than male programmers. And I think that comes from like these quotas in universities way back when. Um, but nothing around childcare, for example, or there was never that opportunity for rebellion for different people to actually express what their unique needs are. And it becomes harder to bring that conversation on. And it's taken years of learning to kind of really start seeing that. And at the time, I was listening to The Guilty Feminist a lot, that podcast, and actually met Deborah, and we kind of became sort of friends. Um, and I was reading more, and kind of it started to build up on like this kind of understanding of, okay, so this is where we exist. And still at the time, I'd worked in the construction industry for a number of years, and I still was in the delusional belief that if I just work hard enough, I'll do well. And I was completely letting the things pass my ears, like, oh, your English is actually so good, and like, oh, sweethearts, don't you tell me about this, and like all these things. I was
Mm,
just complete. And again, this is the kind of the survival mode that I was talking to you
yeah.
about. If you notice those things,
Ingrained.
yeah. And I think it took me a while of that side learning to reapply. At the time I was working in healthcare design, I started kind of really focusing on digital adoption because it can really have an impact on the levels of sustainability of construction. And construction is one of the biggest polluters and the most ineffective users of energy globally in any way, shape, or form. That's probably one of the industries that if we really put the effort in, we can have a huge dent in our efforts for sustainability. But unfortunately, it's very, very hard to change a very rigid and slow industry.
Yeah.
But I kind of saw something in that and started to kind of pivot towards it. So from planning to a little bit more into digital adoption and automation around certain stuff. And that was actually really fun and interesting. And, I was really good at it. You
Yeah.
know, as previously mentioned, I'm fairly smart. So I cope with it.
Yeah.
And I think the big kind of leg up that I had was, and that kind of goes back to my mom as well. Like whenever she'd explain anything to me that's complex, she never made me feel like it's something that's difficult to comprehend.
Yeah.
Right? She was a chemist, um, and when I first started studying chemistry, if you want, I'll tell you how she explained the periodic table. It's hilarious and kind of gay, but like all these things, she would break into parts and kind of hand it to me, knowing that I'll get it. And I've always done that with complex subjects in construction and digital adoption and so on. And I think very few people who are really capable at the time were doing that. You do get the trope of a geeky boy with glasses that looks down and speaks. There wasn't that accessibility. Like there were a group of people, like in an office, that were really good at doing things effectively and well, but they just weren't disseminating. And I
Yeah.
was the person who like really could bring things together. So I kind of became quite successful in that, and ended up speaking various conferences. I was invited to speak in Las Vegas at this conference that's a competitive one. So people usually apply and like thousands, I don't know, maybe hundreds of people are rejected, and they actually invited me. So that was pretty cool. Um, and I was doing a lot of that work. And little by little, I kind of started doing more panels and kind of chiming in, started joining women's groups, women in digital construction, women in architecture, and so on, and started to kind of like get into that sphere. And I could see that there's just so much to be done. And it was just so much more interesting and exciting and
Yeah.
felt more important. So I kind of decided to make the leap.
Yeah, and a lot of DEI is about pulling together so many different ideas and looking at how they overlap and influence and brings into intersectionality and all of those things is the pulling together of theories and ideas and behaviors. And I love that. I love that. And I guess all of this aligned with your unlearning and discovering you, the you we know now.
Yes, 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 yes.
Love. My one of my questions was going to be talk to me about a person who shaped you the most along the way, but I think we've already heard about her.
Maybe you have. Yeah, no, certainly. My mom had a very important influence in my life.
Yeah, amazing. Katya, before we move on to the next section, what are you most proud of to date?
What do you mean, professionally or personally?
Eva?
Well, speaking of my mom, I I've always said always in the last 5 years, but I don't think that will change for me personally. My proudest moment is speaking at my mom's funeral. And it's because it was the hardest thing I've ever done,
Mhm.
but also I'm so happy I managed to do it. I'm so proud I moved through it because my mom was very unusual for her environment, right? Like if she hadn't grown up behind the Iron Curtain, she'd be the wildest hippie you've ever met. And whenever I say that, my sister Betty was like, "What do you mean? She was the wild."
Ah,
She was very unconventional, very kind of different from people around her in so many different ways. So clever, as I said, she was a chemical engineer, but she was also an artist. She also painted. Like I've got that from her as well. So like this kind of eclectic, mm, very rich personality. And unfortunately, she passed away from cancer, and that was a really cruel. It's a cruel disease, we all know. Um, but she also managed to, we had really wonderful conversations, and it doesn't feel like there's anything unsaid. So there's a level of peace when someone passes, especially after such a long battle. But in Bulgaria, traditionally at funerals, what we get in kind of Orthodox tradition is you get a priest who sings,
okay.
and they sing in we call it clergal Bulgarian. Like it's not the contemporary language used, it's a little bit old timey. So you don't really get everything that they say, and it's usually like something from the Bible. So it's very like non-person, like a good priest may choose something that's relevant to the person, but it's not. You don't get the eulogy. We don't have a tradition
Yeah.
of eulogizing, um, and that particular priest at the time when she passed away, there was something happening politically where the government gave away cremation rights to private companies or whatever, and they were having like a big, like the church was very mad at everything and wanted to make cremation seem bad. And my mom was adamant. Like my mom was also very comfortable talking about death even before she was unwell. That's another big, amazing lesson that I've had from her. And she was always very like, everybody dies. That's a normal part of life. And she was so clear about being cremated forever. She made sure that all of her children knew, that her husband knew. Like, it was just like, this is what I want. And this priest was so mad about it. And he'd said some really awful things to my dad before, which was awful, right? Because he was grieving spouse and awful time. But it's a small town. We don't have much of a choice. Things like that. Things need to be done in a certain time frame, whatever. And he was just there doing that. And he started singing, and everybody needs to kind of stand up. And there were a lot of elderly women there that couldn't stand up. And some of them like tried to sit or perch, and he would like make
Right.
them stand up. He started singing, and they were like stuff about the darkness of the beyond and the I don't even know how to translate those words, but like really awful things about burning in purgatory or whatever. It was just like, what's going on? What, like, and he kept going on and on forever. And then he finished singing and he said, and I need to say, cremation is a sin. And I just stood up. I don't know what possessed me. Again, like, this is a small town. Afterwards, I was thinking, like, if this didn't go the way it did, I could have created problems for my dad and stuff. But I stood up and I was like, you gotta go. I just showed him that we booed him out. Fortunately, there were a couple of other my mom's friend, like bigger men, who like came behind me and was like, "Yeah, you gotta go." And we booed the priest out, which I think my mom would have laughed at and would have loved. And then I stood up and I spoke about her and like the beautiful gifts she gave us all and so on. And I cried through the whole thing, but I managed to make that space to be like, forget about that shit. This was a life that is worth talking about. It was a joy for us all. And what she would have wanted was to celebrate this and to kind of find ways to smile even when we don't want. I'm going to start crying.
I'm welling up.
But it's like a joyful cry almost. It was, I don't know. I was so happy I could get through it. And then I'd organized, when we get together, I'd like printed a bunch of photos and made like this book where people could pick photos and like put them in and write things and take them away and just to kind of create memories. And we played her favorite music. Again, on funerals in Bulgaria, you do not play music. Any music is forbidden. And we just made it a good day.
Yeah.
I'm so proud of that.
You should be. It sounds like you bought her spirit, but you also brought her love and her reasoning and your color to it. I love that. That's so beautiful.
My color is from her. It's from her.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. Absolutely beautiful.
Thank you.
The House of Happiness is London's ultimate sober clubbing extravaganza. We're led and delivered but created for all, whether teetotal, sober curious, or just taking a booze snooze. We love a day rave, and on a Saturday afternoon you can expect banging house tunes, DJs on decks, dancers on podiums, and a fully stocked alcohol-free bar. Flamboyant, bold, with a glitter station to boot. We're all about safe, inclusive fun, and we even have a pre-meet so that you can make new sober buddies before you hit the dance floor. Grab your tickets from Instagram now at House of Happiness Official, and we'll see you on the dance floor. Are you ready for some quick fire questions?
Let's do it.
Let's go for it. What album, book, or movie has had a lasting impact on you?
Okay, so this may not sound great, but hear me out.
Okay, here we go.
Especially around sexuality, I think a huge impact on me was a little book that you may know called The Da Vinci Code.
Okay, tell me more.
So this is a quick fire round, but I read it when I was fairly young, maybe like 13 or 14. And at the time, I still wasn't in high school where we were all talking about sex all the time. And in my hometown, despite my mom specifically being fairly like liberated, I had such a huge taboo around sex and sexuality, and I just felt like it was something awful that when you get married, hopefully, you get through it quickly. Kind of like it was this completely forbidden thing, and like anybody who had sex outside of marriage, awful. And I remember reading that book, and it just suggests some stuff around how Christianity has shaped Western culture to have a lot of shame around sex.
Yeah.
And because of that, I then sought out other resources and read out other things around understanding that. And it really just kind of did something like this to my brain. It was like, oh no, sex is fine. Okay. We can talk about that. Pleasure is good. And it was just such it was the pivoting point was that book. So you can talk all you want about how problematic it is or whatever. I love that. I love
Amazing.
That. Brought me to a helpful place.
It's been ages since I've read that. What's the saying you live by and one that you'd put in the bin?
So something I say a lot, and most of my friends have learned now, it's a Bulgarian saying, and I really think they should stop, is may the chicken shit on that. And it's the sort of it's kind of don't jinx it. It's what we say when something is really good and you don't want the devil to see it or the demons to see it and come and take it. May it have a little bit of chicken shit on it, so they don't notice. But I think ultimately it's very negative. It's very typical Balkan culture of like nothing can be really nice. Like let's smear some shit on. And I think I live by it a little bit, and I need to stop. So
well, we're facing a general election, so it feels quite relevant.
Yeah.
May the chicken shit on it.
May the chicken shit on it. And it's meant to be good, right? And it's funny, so I'd still use it. But the one that I'd certainly live by, and I love idioms. I'm a deep, deep lover of idioms. There's an Australian one. I think you said the F word already. We're allowed to.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
I'm not here to fuck spiders. Have you heard that?
No.
I can't say it in Australian accent. I wish I could.
I'm not here to fuck spiders.
I'm not here to fuck spiders. It means like I'm not here to joke about. I'm here for serious business, and I love it. That's usually how I show up. I'm not here to fuck spiders.
Brilliant. What's one that you put in the bin?
Well, the chicken shit is the one.
You want to put it in the bin, even though it's a love-hate relationship with it.
Yeah, I think conceptually I need to like start being open to perfection. Open to real good things that shine on their own.
Liam, what's been the best adventure of your life so far?
Oof, that was a difficult one. I looked at them and I was just trying to figure out what to kind of pick out from there. I've been very lucky to do a few lovely road trips here and there. Once I did one by myself and I got lost in the Finnish woods.
Okay.
In June. And I was trying to find this building. It's a very important building. It's a Pioneer Sanatorium by Alvar Out. But it was in June, so the sun just stays up. Like you have no indication of time passing properly.
Mm-hmm.
And I was walking this road, which, in American films, when they go on a road trip and there's this road that just goes like with this and gets lost in the horizon. It was the same, but with trees. I just kept walking, and the sun wouldn't set, and I forget what I was. And I enlisted an elderly couple that was passing by in a car. I stopped them, and they helped me eventually.
Did you find the building?
Yeah, I did. And then on the way back, I got lost again. And it was still the sun was still out. But I just kind of figured out, and I would have been 21 or 2. And thinking about this now, I think I had a Nokia. Some kind of Nokia phone that maybe would have had a map, but it was one of those back when where they didn't really work properly. So how did I? What? How?
Yeah. How did we get around before? Crazy.
But also how did I decide to pick my ass up, go to Finland, and try and pursue something in the countryside with no transport? I can't drive. I don't have a car. I'm just trying to get there.
Yes.
But I'm still here, so there you go.
And you saw the building. You saw what you achieved it.
I did, and it was an excellent building.
It was worth the getting lost. What 3 words would you use to describe you and your origin story?
Driven Balkan Geek.
Driven Balkan Geek.
Yes.
Love. Thank you so much. Do you relish in the geeky side?
Oh, so much. So much.
What do you most geek out about?
Oh my God. Where do we start? I think I just have this tendency when I'm interested in something, I just get into it real deep. In school, I loved chemistry. I loved maths. I knew everything about it. I get into various fandoms, painting and stuff. Recently, at the moment, I'm geeking out on Bridgerton. Because this is what
yes, loving, so buzzing for next month for part 2. So
I could not wait, right? So I just tend to be this kind of person. When something excites me and I'm interested in, I just go in and have all of the information of it as soon as I can.
Love that. Let's fast forward a little bit. What exciting things do you have coming up?
Well, Recently I started something which I'm really excited about, and it makes me feel like, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I met someone very randomly on LinkedIn, Dr. Stephen Maxwell. He is a health researcher. And we just started chatting about, EDI consulting, how to get around things, so on, like practical advice and so on such. And my usual advice is to kind of look into industry groups when you're trying to kind of get contacts in the industry. Oh, sorry. To get contacts in the industry. And I was like, oh, do you have like an LGBTQ plus, health researcher or healthcare related group that you can join? I was like, oh, I don't think there's one. And we were just spitballing, and I started thinking about, you know, ideas around it. And sometimes I get good ideas. I was thinking, okay, what could it be called if you start one? Like, oh, what if it's a health association for queers? And that reads hacked. And then you can use it to hack at the system. And it kind of like came together really quickly, and we decided to work on it. And now we're gonna do it. And we're starting Hack Health Association for Queers, which will be an organization that runs events where we gather this particular intersection of health researchers, healthcare professionals, practitioners, and LGBTQI plus people, and ideally an intersection of all, right? Like healthcare people who are also queer, to try and start gathering evidence-based solutions to the inequities we're facing, because there's just been so much blatant lies out in the world around what queer health looks like and what's healthy for all, that it's becoming more and more infuriating. And this is how we lose ourselves, right? So we have our first event on the 11th of June. You can find us on LinkedIn, Hack Health Association for Queers, and there's details about that event there as well. So we're going to get people together. We're always going to try and give some kind of piece of knowledge in the events around Stephen's research specifically this time. And we're also going to get hacking. We're going to start thinking about the particular barriers there are, and with the brains we have there, we're going to start thinking of solutions. So hopefully we can then broadcast these thoughts out in the world and continue to do it.
Love that. Thank you so much for sharing. Exclusive here. Love that. What brings you joy? And we've touched on a few things, but
Painting. At the moment, it's painting big time.
yeah, beautiful. What takeaways do you have for anyone listening wanting to carve out a career in inclusion?
I think, and this is, I've been asked this question many times, especially like from other colleagues who kind of want to join. I think the first most important thing to think about is decide how much of yourself you're willing to involve in that work. Because for a lot of us, it has to do with our identities, and you need to be aware of what that will mean to you.
Yep.
You don't have to involve your identity as much, but it needs to be an intentional kind of approach to it, because you don't want to find yourself being made to make yourself vulnerable and open yourself up for the work if you're not ready and if it's not something that you want to do. Okay. So I think it's a real serious thinking about how much of yourself, which aspects of yourself, and kind of craft that step with that intentionally. And then just kind of don't leave your day job yet. Especially in the last year, it's been challenging. We've seen even there was a report by the government that came out in the end of March about the efficacies of EDI work, and I've written an article about it. I'd recommend having a look at more detailed look of it, but it's been a push against that work. We've seen a lot of famous people speaking out negatively about it, so it's not the easiest space right now. So make sure that you're safe, make sure that you can pay your bills, and then do that work in a way that feels good and feels comfortable first, because taking care of number one is the most important thing.
Absolutely. Final question for you, Katya. What words of wisdom or encouragement for anyone out there do you have for anyone out there to help them get to wherever they're going?
Don't fuck spiders.
Don't fuck spiders. Love that.
Just be intentional. Yeah.
What a finish. Katya, thank you so much for joining me on Pause and Rewind. I knew this would be a brilliant conversation, and it did not disappoint. You are colourful and wonderful, and I really appreciate you.
Oh, thank you so much, Nia. It's a joy.
Thank you. See you soon.
Yeah.
Wow, I genuinely feel so moved by this conversation. I walk away from every conversation on Pause and Rewind just feeling so inspired and yeah, in awe of people's stories. Hearing Katya talk about their upbringing and being, really focused student and feeling this need partly because of their upbringing and the education system in Bulgaria to be working and then part-time jobs to allowing themselves to feeling an organic freedom to shift in life and to make changes and to make space for themselves to be creative and breathe and heal. And the way that Katya, that's a constant process. Yeah, just a phenomenal conversation. I loved the three words Katya uses to describe their origin story: driven Balkan geek, and Katya's love of geeking out over all sorts and fandoms and Bridgerton. Share that love. But yeah, just an incredibly moving conversation. One that's littered with lots of takeaways for people, whether wanting to carve out a career in inclusion or simply just finding your way in the world. Katya, thank you so much. Thank you so much for all the colour that you bring to the world. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. Please like, subscribe, share, review. My husband's always nagging me to say that at the end, so I'm going to throw it out there. Please do so. I love these conversations. I hope you do too. Stay tuned for more. Cheers.